Deus virtutum convertere et Domine converte nos. Respice de celo et vide et visita vineam istam et protegeam quam plantavi dextera tuam. Illustra faciem tuam et salvierimus. Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater, et Filius, et Spiritus Sanctus.
My beloved children in Christ, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, what if a single word from the Pope could shake the Church to its core? Not a fiery sermon or sweeping decree, but one quiet word, uttered with purpose. A word that divides bishops, stuns the faithful, and electrifies the world in a matter of seconds. Could it be a blunder? Or was it a message from heaven itself, a divine interruption meant to jolt us from spiritual sleep? Walk with me through what happened, and by the end, you might be left without words. That evening, the great bells of St. Peter's Basilica had not yet tolled when the crowd began to thicken. St. Peter's Square was filled like a chalice with the faithful. Pilgrims from across continents pressed shoulder to shoulder, their hands wrapped around rosaries, flags dancing in the golden twilight of a Roman Sunday. The air shimmered with reverence, yet it trembled with something more, an unspoken anticipation, as if all of heaven leaned in to listen. Among those gathered was Maria Alvarez from Los Angeles, a woman who had saved for years just to stand here tonight. Her knuckles were bone white from gripping her rosary. Prayers whispered in soft Spanish, calling back memories of the Pope not as a pontiff, but as a humble missionary in Latin America. She remembered him walking the dusty barrios, feeding souls and bodies alike. To her, he had always been a shepherd, a light in the shadows. And now, as she stared up at the empty balcony, her heart beat with both love and fear. What was about to unfold? Around her, youthful voices swelled in hymn, blending into a river of sound. Others raised banners painted with phrases like, "Pastor of the People." On the edges of the square, cameras snapped to life, and microphones caught the whisper of wind. Journalists leaned forward, sensing history pressing in. Behind the heavy curtains of the Apostolic Palace, Pope Leo XIV stood alone in the stillness, though his reign was young. His face bore the lines of sleepless nights, and prayers wrestled in silence. He looked not like a man broken, but one who had made peace with something weighty. Within his soul, a word had burned for weeks, a word he knew could not be unsaid. It had been carried through hours of agonizing prayer, shaped in the quiet before the crucifix, whispered by the Spirit, unavoidable now. He had not chosen this lightly. But peace, the kind that does not waver, had settled in his bones. He knew this word would not merely echo in the Basilica, but across the world, yet he felt no fear. The storm would come, but he would not turn away. Behind him, a line of cardinals stood, draped in crimson, their eyes tense and jaws tight. Cardinal Severossi stood closest, rigid with dread. "A champion of tradition," he murmured to a fellow cardinal, his voice brittle. "If he says what I fear, the Church will split in two." The younger clergy around him shifted nervously, hearts caught between duty and doubt. In the far corner, Father Gabriel Tran, a Vietnamese-American theologian studying in Rome, observed with wide eyes. A lifelong admirer of Leo XIV's humility and closeness to the poor, he now feared what this unpredictable act might unleash. And then it happened. The curtains pulled back. A tidal wave of cheers crashed from the square, only to fall eerily silent the moment the Pope appeared. His white cassock shimmered in the fading light, but his face did not smile. Instead, it bore a gravity that was hard to name, solemn, steady, and somehow unsettling. He scanned the masses below, thousands of faces, gazing up with desperate hope. The weight of their gaze did not shake him. When he spoke, his voice was even calm and unmistakably sure. "Brothers and sisters, children of God," he said, "tonight I must share with you a decision that will forever alter the course of our church." The crowd froze in collective breath. Reporters clicked. Frantically, Cardinals stiffened. Father Gabriel gripped his hands so tightly they ached. Maria kissed her crucifix, her lips moving in silent prayer. And then the word Renéa. It landed like thunder. At first, silence, a suffocating, unnatural silence, as if time itself recoiled. The pigeons above the Basilica hovered, still in midair. No one moved. Then came the ripple. Gasps tore through the crowd. Fingers raced across keyboards. Pope announces resignation flashed in breaking banners across phones and screens. Leo XIV steps down. Some headlines read, "Around the square, sobs broke through the disbelief. A woman collapsed to her knees, crying out through the microphone, 'He cannot leave us. Not now.'" The word spread like lightning across live streams. Young pilgrims hugged, sobbing. Some trembled as they continued to pray. Inside the palace, aides dashed through hallways. Doors slammed. Rumors erupted. Cardinals whispered of conclaves and succession. Yet others dared to hope, had he truly resigned? Was Renéa something deeper than resignation? Cardinal Rossi turned pale, his voice cracking. "It is the end," he murmured. "The shepherd leaves us in the storm." A journalist overheard, and within seconds, his quote exploded online. A Vatican insider says, "It is the end." Panic rippled across global news networks. Confusion reigned. But as the chaos erupted, one question echoed louder than the rest. What had the Pope truly meant? Was it resignation, a spiritual declaration, or a mysterious act that none yet understood? Stay with me. The journey is far from over, and what unfolds next might change everything. The silence that followed Pope Leo XIV's single word clung to the square like a veil, heavy and unmoving. Even the statues atop street. Peter's Basilica seemed frozen in stone contemplation. It wasn't just quiet, it was weighty, as if time itself had been suspended and every soul in that square was holding their breath in disbelief. Overhead, storm clouds thickened, slowly crawling over Rome's skyline, echoing the unrest swelling below. Many pilgrims remained fixed in place, as if their bodies refused to move until some kind of understanding arrived. Their candles flickered in the moist air, trembling like their hearts. Maria Alvarez stood among them, no longer gripping her rosary, but simply staring, stunned. She had come to Rome for peace, for clarity, but now found herself stranded in a storm of uncertainty. "Renéa," she whispered aloud, trying to feel the meaning in her own voice. Could the Pope truly be resigning? And if so, why did it feel different? There was something strange about the way he had spoken it. More invitation than exit. A departure, perhaps, but not from faith. From what, then? Up in the Apostolic Palace, order had collapsed into chaos. The cardinals who had braced for a ceremonial blessing, or at worst a political statement, now found themselves blindsided. Cardinal Rossi, red-faced and pacing furiously, was the first to give voice to the anxiety surging through the inner chambers. "What have we allowed?" he muttered. "What madness have we permitted?" His voice bounced off the stone walls like a judgment in itself. "We cannot let this happen. He cannot follow through. The Church is hanging over a cliff." But Rossi wasn't alone in his reaction. His words set off waves of discussion, argument, even panic. Some agreed immediately, their faces tense with the realization that the Church might now be sailing into unfamiliar waters without a rudder. But others, quieter and more introspective, questioned whether they had misunderstood. What if the Pope wasn't abandoning his post, but rather stepping into something new? What if this was obedience, not rebellion? Among them, Father Gabriel Tran remained in quiet reflection. Just hours earlier, he had stood near the Holy Father, watching as the word Renéa was spoken into eternity. And even then, something had stirred deep within him, an aching curiosity, a suspicion that maybe, just maybe, the Pope wasn't running away from the papacy, but pointing the Church toward something it had long forgotten. Could this be the Spirit, not chaos? Could this be faith in motion, rather than collapse? As the night deepened, the Vatican press office worked feverishly. Lights burned behind frosted windows as journalists scrambled to capture the headlines of a century. Global news networks had already rolled out banners with phrases like "Pope shocks world with resignation" and "Is this the end of the papacy?" Theories bloomed in real time, spreading across social media faster than facts could keep up. For every voice condemning the Pope's actions, another called him courageous. For every priest that warned of division, another whispered about renewal. Far beyond the walls of Rome, the reaction spread like a heartbeat. In Chicago, the early morning streets of the city's Catholic neighborhoods were filled with disbelief. Some parishioners turned to their priests, demanding explanation, while others huddled in prayer circles, tears flowing freely as they tried to understand what this meant for their faith. For some, it was abandonment. For others, a mystery yet to unfold. In Lima, Peru, Maria's family, those who had once walked the barrios with Father Leo before he ever wore white, gathered around televisions and live streams. They remembered him not as a symbol, but as a man who had shared their bread, their grief, their hopes. The news hit them not as political drama, but personal heartbreak. Yet even in their mourning, there was a certain resolve. "He has never acted without love," one elderly woman said, holding a candle to her chest. "This must be love again. We will follow." Back in Rome, Pope Leo XIV knelt alone in his chapel, the shadows of candlelight dancing across the walls. His eyes rested on the crucifix, the Menden, silent witness to his every wrestling thought. And yet he felt no unrest. Though the Church behind him was in uproar, though the world screamed for clarification, he remained in stillness. He had spoken the word. The consequences would follow, but his soul was settled. The decision had not come quickly nor easily, but it had come from prayer, from the weight of listening. Outside, rain began to fall. A slow drizzle at first, then steady, and still the pilgrims in St. Peter's Square did not leave. They stood under umbrellas and soaked cloaks, voices rising again in prayer. The square became a sea of light, candle flames glowing defiantly against the dark. Rosaries twinkled in the rain, a galaxy of devotion. Maria Alvarez remained among them, her eyes red but calm. She wasn't weeping anymore. Something inside her had shifted, despite the uncertainty, despite the rumors and arguments. She felt steady. Maybe this wasn't the collapse of the church. Maybe it was the Spirit breathing through it once more. Maybe it was time to stop looking only to the past for answers. Maybe faith was about listening forward. The Vatican, once a fortress of doctrine and certainty, now stood as a place of questions, of aching silence. But in that silence, there was not absence, there was presence. The faithful were not fleeing. They were staying. They were praying. They were watching, not for a retreat, but for a revelation. Whatever storm had been unleashed, it had not broken them, not yet. They stood in the rain, in the dark, eyes fixed on a window they hoped would open again. And the question that burned in every soul, what had Pope Leo truly renounced? The answer was coming. By morning, the air above the Vatican was thick with uncertainty. Though dawn painted the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square with soft golden light, the mood was anything but tranquil. The previous night's shock had left the world breathless, and as Rome awakened, so too did its questions. Was the Pope truly resigning? Had he merely spoken a symbolic word? Or had he issued a challenge meant to test the faith of the Church itself? Pilgrims, still wrapped in damp coats and holding extinguished candles, lingered as if waiting for a second act. They murmured prayers, not with the fervor of protest, but the aching need for clarity. Their eyes, red from fatigue, remained fixed on the window where Pope Leo XIV had appeared. The word Renéa still echoed in their minds, a single utterance now wrapped in layers of mystery. Within the apostolic palace, tension had hardened like stone. No one walked casually. Every step was urgent, every whisper calculated. Cardinals, bishops, and senior clergy moved like men trapped between storm and fire. Cardinal Rossi, sleepless and fuming, had summoned an emergency meeting. The consistory chamber buzzed with muffled voices until Rossi entered, his face grave. His hands gripping a folder so tightly the pages threatened to tear. He slammed the papers onto the long oak table, his eyes scanning the faces of his fellow cardinals. "This cannot stand," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "What happened last night, whatever he meant, cannot go unanswered. If this is a resignation, we must act swiftly. If it is not, then it is worse. It is confusion sown into the heart of the Church." The room remained still, but the silence was charged. Several cardinals nodded slowly, their expressions drawn with concern, but not all were convinced. A few leaned back in their chairs, eyes narrowed, waiting to hear more. Tradition had always been the glue of their unity. But what if the Holy Spirit was speaking outside the familiar patterns? In the dim corridors beyond that chamber, Father Gabriel Tran walked slowly, one hand trailing the cold stone wall as his mind swirled. He had witnessed everything, yet even now he could not explain it. He had stood near the Pope, heard the word, felt its reverberation in his chest. And still, he was torn. Was this a mistake? Or had Pope Leo XIV revealed something the Church needed to confront? Gabriel had never questioned tradition before. He had studied it, defended it, shaped sermons around it. But now, he wondered, could tradition become a barrier when the Spirit called the Church into the unknown? Could a word like Renéa mean more than departure? Could it mean release? Outside the Vatican walls, the world spun in chaos. In newsrooms from New York to Nairobi, editors argued over headlines. Crisis in Rome ran alongside prophetic step or papal breakdown. In Chicago, the heart of American Catholicism, believers gathered in churches, lighting candles and reciting the rosary, unsure whether to mourn or rejoice. Their Pope Leo XIV, once their friend and comforter, had broken all expectations. Was it brave or reckless? In Lima, Peru, where Maria Alvarez's family remained glued to the news, the confusion was no less personal. There, Leo XIV was still Padre Leo, the missionary who had knelt beside the sick and sung songs in dusty chapels. For them, his word was not a political act, it was a spiritual gesture. Perhaps, one local priest said to a group gathered outside the cathedral, he is not stepping down from leadership, but from safety, from the page, from the plan. Perhaps he's inviting us to live what we only preach. Back in the Pope's private chapel, Leo XIV remained in quiet solitude. The morning light streamed through stained glass, bathing the crucifix in colors of blood and sky. He had heard the cries, he had seen the headlines, but his heart remained at peace. The decision had not been impulsive. It had come through wrestling, through fire, through the silence of early mornings and sleepless nights. And now he waited. Outside, the rain had slowed, but the people had not left. Street Peter Square remained a canvas of umbrellas and bowed heads, candle wax pooled on stone. The faithful did not demand answers, they prayed for discernment. Maria stood once again near the center of the crowd. Her fingers curled around the rosary she had carried since childhood. The confusion still pressed against her like the cold, but within her heart a strange light had kindled. She wasn't sure what the Pope had done. She wasn't sure anyone was, but she knew one thing. She had not come all this way for a man. She had come for God. And something in her spirit whispered that this moment of bewilderment was holy. Within the palace, debate intensified. Rossi's voice thundered across the consistory. The Church cannot survive like this. We must demand clarification or convene a conclave. We cannot let silence reign. But other cardinals offered caution. Let us not move out of fear, one said. Let us wait to hear from him again. The Holy Father may yet speak again, more clearly, more fully. But the weight of the unknown was growing. Could Leo XIV be persuaded to step back from this strange ledge he'd approached? Or was he leading them all into a future they had not dared imagine? Some believed a fracture was inevitable. Others sensed a reformation. But no one could deny that the Church stood on unfamiliar ground. Maria Alvarez raised her face to the sky. The clouds were clearing slowly, light piercing through. Perhaps this wasn't the end of certainty. Perhaps it was the beginning of trust. And far above her, in a room thick with incense and silence, Pope Leo XIV remained where he had been all along, on his knees before the crucifix, praying not to be understood, but to be faithful. The days that followed Pope Leo XIV's unexpected pronouncement stretched long and uneasy. Though outwardly calm, the Vatican pulsed with silent unrest. The word Renéa had not faded. It had embedded itself into every conversation, every corridor, every prayer. In the cafes and press rooms of Rome, speculation burned like incense. Some insisted the Pope was stepping down. Others believed something more radical was happening, something deeper than resignation. Inside the Apostolic Palace, meetings continued behind heavy doors. The emergency consistory, once a rare occurrence, had become routine. Cardinal Rossi, still at the helm of opposition, gathered supporters with fiery urgency. To him, Leo XIV's vague declaration was a threat not just to the papacy, but to the identity of the Church itself. "We are a church of structure," he repeated to anyone who would listen, "of doctrine, of order. If the Pope abandons that, what are we?" But not everyone shared Rossi's alarm. Some cardinals, though cautious, urged patience. Others felt conflicted, torn between loyalty to tradition and an unshakable feeling that the Spirit might be moving in ways they could not yet see. And then there were those quiet, watchful, who believed the Pope had touched something holy. Father Gabriel Tran spent his days in quiet contemplation, drifting between prayer and thought. He had grown close to Pope Leo XIV in recent months, serving as a translator during private audiences and accompanying him to meetings with the poor. Gabriel had seen the Pope's compassion firsthand, his simplicity, his prayer life, his conviction. But now even he wasn't sure what to think. Every hallway buzzed with theories. Some whispered of heresy. Others feared schism. The only thing they all shared was uncertainty. What Gabriel couldn't forget, though, was the way Leo XIV had spoken that night. The steadiness in his voice, the peace in his eyes. This was no breakdown, no confusion. It was a deliberate act, a rupture, perhaps, but not without clarity. Could it be that the Pope had not renounced the papacy, but rather the way it had been practiced? Could he be calling them away from safety and into faith? Meanwhile, journalists flooded Rome. The Vatican press office was overrun. Emails poured in by the thousands. Every word the Pope had spoken was dissected, analyzed, translated, and spun. Headlines still clashed with one another. Some called it a spiritual coup. Others declared it a prophetic turning point. News anchors debated what would happen next. Would the College of Cardinals demand clarification? Would Leo XIV be forced to step down? Or would the Church enter a season of reform? Across the globe, believers struggled to make sense of it. In Chicago, Catholics who had known Leo XIV during his time as cardinal were especially shaken. They remembered him as a man of mercy, a defender of the marginalized, a priest who had knelt in soup kitchens and blessed undocumented families in alleyway chapels. For many, the idea that he was abandoning them felt impossible. In Lima, the reaction remained raw. Leo XIV had once walked those streets in worn sandals. He had prayed with farmers, eaten with the dying, and baptized children under tin roofs. His resignation, or whatever this was, felt like the loss of a father. Yet in their sorrow, there was also stubborn hope. "He taught us not to cling to form, but to cling to faith," said one old man outside a chapel, Maybe he is teaching us still. Back in the Apostolic Palace, Pope Leo XIV's daily life went on quietly. He celebrated Mass each morning, met with pilgrims in the afternoon, and returned to prayer by night. From the outside, it looked as though nothing had changed, but those close to him saw the strain. His eyes, though steady, were more tired. His posture slightly bent beneath the weight of misunderstanding, and yet his peace had not left him. Gabriel, watching from a distance, wondered how the Pope endured the growing tension, the rumors, the pushback, the endless calls for clarity. And still, Leo XIV said nothing more. He let the word Renéa stand. It was as if he trusted the silence to do what explanations could not. One morning, as Gabriel walked the halls of the palace, he overheard voices. Cardinals gathered again in private conversation. Their tone was sharp, though hushed. "His actions are reckless," said one. "The people need clarity." "But what if clarity isn't the goal?" another asked. "What if we're meant to sit in the unknown and learn how to listen again?" Gabriel froze. Those words struck him like a chord. Learn how to listen again. Maybe that was it. Maybe Leo XIV hadn't spoken for understanding, but for awakening. Maybe the ambiguity was the point. Back in the square, Maria Alvarez continued her quiet vigil. The weather had turned, but she remained. She no longer waited for answers. She waited for trust to take root. She had stopped trying to make sense of it all. Now she simply prayed. Her eyes often wandered to the balcony, not with expectation, but with peace. Her heart no longer demanded clarity. It asked only for grace. In those quiet days that followed the announcement, the church didn't fall apart. It held its breath. And in that stillness, something remarkable began to happen. People began to lean in, not away. The faithful who had once clung to predictability started asking deeper questions. They gathered not to be reassured, but to reflect. And in that space, something holy stirred. Weeks had passed, and still the tremors from Pope Leo XIV's pronouncement could be felt across every corner of the Catholic world. Though the initial fury had quieted, the Church remained suspended in an unfamiliar stillness, as if holding its collective breath before a decision yet to come. The Cardinals, once loud and divided, now moved through the Vatican halls with a deeper restraint. Their debates had not ceased, but the volume had lowered, and the urgency had shifted into something quieter, something more contemplative. Cardinal Rossi, the fiercest critic of the Pope's unexplained word, continued to lead meetings behind closed doors. He remained convinced that Leo XIV had endangered the integrity of the Church. But even he could feel the ground beneath him shifting. His calls for immediate correction were no longer echoed with the same intensity. Whispers filled the air about the Spirit, about a new voice rising from within the old walls. The unity Rossi sought to defend was no longer threatened only by disorder, but perhaps by his own refusal to see change for what it might truly be. Necessary. Out in the square, Maria Alvarez still stood among the faithful. What had begun as a pilgrimage had transformed into something far deeper, an encounter not just with Rome or the papacy, but with the very mystery of faith. Her heart, once filled with anxiety, now beat with a strange assurance. She no longer sought clarity in the Pope's word. She sought communion with the silence that had followed it. In the stillness of her own soul, she had found a kind of answer. Her prayers had changed. They were no longer desperate petitions for explanation. They had become offerings, quiet declarations of trust. "Lord, I do not understand," she whispered one evening beneath the balcony, "but I believe you are here." And with that, she found peace, not because the world made sense, but because she no longer demanded that it must. Inside the palace, Pope Leo XIV continued in his quiet rhythm. He rose early. He prayed without fanfare. He met with the poor, the sick, and the voiceless. His daily acts of service spoke volumes, though his public voice remained silent. Those who met with him often left with more questions than answers, but always with the sense that they had stood in the presence of someone deeply rooted in God. Father Gabriel Tran watched all this unfold with an ever-deepening awareness. His private reflections had grown into a quiet conviction. Leo XIV's decision had not been a collapse, but a calling. It was not the abandonment of the papacy, but the rejection of safety. The Pope had not fled from tradition, he had stepped beyond it into something living, breathing, uncontainable. Still, the divide within the Church remained. The corridors of the Vatican echoed with competing visions of the future. Some still feared that the Pope had destabilized the faith. Others believed he had saved it. What both sides shared was a recognition that nothing would ever be the same again. Gabriel had heard whispers of schism, rumors of ultimatums being prepared. Some cardinals were speaking of formal measures, of drafting a response, of taking steps to either clarify or constrain the Pope's words. Yet he sensed these movements were fading, slowly being overtaken by something more powerful than control, reflection. And reflection was spreading beyond Rome. Across the world, something unexpected began to unfold. The faithful, who had once looked to the Vatican for certainty, began to find God in the space between answers. Parishes held prayer vigils, not to demand resolution, but to listen. Small groups formed to discuss what it meant to follow Christ in a time of uncertainty. And everywhere, people were speaking less about papal authority and more about the Spirit. In this quiet awakening, Maria Alvarez saw a church she recognized again, not one rooted only in doctrine, but in living faith. She remembered the Pope's words from his earlier days. Faith does not survive on paper. It lives in the hearts of God's people. It rang true now more than ever. Perhaps, she thought, that's what Renéa meant. Not resignation from office, but surrender to the will of God, no matter how uncertain it felt. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV moved through each day as before, though those closest to him could see the cost. His steps were slower, his face more etched with weariness, but his eyes remained bright. He had not doubted for a moment that he was walking the right path, even if it meant walking alone. He did not explain himself to the press. He did not issue clarifications. He simply continued. Gabriel struggled with the tension in his heart. He understood the fear of the other priests, the anxiety of tradition being challenged, but he also understood the deeper beauty of what was unfolding. Every time he stood near the Pope, he felt it a quiet fire, a voice that did not roar, but whispered, a faith that did not dominate, but invited. One morning, As he passed a group of cardinals in conversation, he overheard something that stopped him. Maybe, one said, this isn't the end of the church as we know it. Maybe it's the beginning of the church as God wants it to be. The words lingered in Gabriel's heart. That evening he walked through the square and saw Maria kneeling again, rosary in hand, head bowed in stillness. Around her, dozens of others had gathered, not protesting, not demanding, simply praying. Their presence was not a reaction, it was a statement. And somewhere, perhaps unseen by all, a new page had begun to turn. Inside the Vatican, in the small chapel where it had all begun, Pope Leo XIV knelt in silence. The crucifix before him bore the familiar image of sacrifice and of unwavering love. The world remained uncertain. The church remained divided. But he remained at peace. He whispered one final prayer, the same he had whispered before speaking that single word to the world, "Let your will be done." And with that, he rose calm, resolved, and ready to continue walking the path that only God could fully see.